I started 2 months ago.
Okay, everybody, I think we're going to get started. If everyone could take a seat. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming to today's discussion of creating the enabling environment for effective fisheries enforcement. My name is Gib Clark. I'm the Program Associate of the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Quick word about the Wilson Center in case this is your first time here. Sorry for repeating some history if you've heard this before. The Wilson Center was formed in 1968 by an act of Congress as the official living memorial to our nation's 28th president. As Wilson was our only president with a PhD, the purpose of the center was laid out to unite the world of policy with the world of ideas. This is our fifth session in a series of events on fisheries management. We're very thankful to USAID, especially Barbara Best and Richard Volk from EGAT with USAID for their collaboration and support of this series. Our last session, our fourth session, was on the globalization of trade with fisheries. And one of the big questions that come out of the session was, once developing countries have laid out a framework, and once we've helped, and once they've developed the means to address enforcement, to address the rules of fishing, how do we deal with enforcement? Rules and regulations and frameworks are worthless unless you can enforce what you've laid out. So that's what we'd like to look at in today's session. Our next session will be 2 weeks from Thursday, the 26th of April, and an invitation for that should be arriving shortly in your inboxes, so be on the lookout for that. For today's session, we're thrilled to have two experts presenting today and a third serving as our discussant. More information is available on this, about the speakers in the handout you could have picked up at the door or you can pick up on your way out. But for now, I'll just give you a very brief intro to the three speakers. First, we have Tom Grasso. He is the Acting Director of the Fisheries Conservation Program for the WWF. This program works to restore depleted ocean fisheries, conserve important biodiversity regions, and address governance issues such as mainstreaming sustainable fisheries in national and international development policies and practices. Next, we'll hear from Kieran Kelleher. He is a senior fisheries specialist at the World Bank and leads its Pro-Fish program. Before joining the bank 2 years ago in 2005, he worked as a research scientist, fisherman, manager of fish farms, and fish processing plants, and also served as an advisor to fishing ministries in developing countries. Finally, we have Rebecca Lent, who will be serving as our discussant. Reflecting on the two presentations, she has served as director of NOAA's Office of International Affairs since 2005. Previously at NOAA, she was deputy assistant administrator for regulatory programs, where she has been since 2001. And before that, she was at NOAA also from 1992, serving as the economist and chief of the Atlantic Highly Migratory Species Management Division. So we're going to have first hear from Tom, and then after our presentations and discussant, we will pass around microphones for questions. We are webcasting this event, so please, when it's your turn to speak, please identify yourself and speak into the microphone so that we can see you online. Okay, Tom?
Thanks, Gib. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see a bunch of familiar faces here, and but it's also great to see some new faces as well. So some of you will actually maybe have heard this for the first time, as opposed to some of you may have heard this before. What I'm going to do with my brief presentation is give you a brief overview of what's happening with fisheries globally, the biodiversity implications to start with, because that's where WWF comes from as its foundation. But more significantly, I'd like to talk to you about some of the socioeconomic implications of the global fishing crisis. And then talk to you a little bit about a couple of places in the world, Africa and Southeast Asia, where this is a particularly pernicious issue. And then just give you a few examples of some of the things that are going on in terms of trying to address the issue. My title for my presentation is Create an Enabling Environment for Better Fisheries Governance and Enforcement. And I guess the overarching theme of my presentation is really looking at fisheries and global fisheries in particular as a system and it's a system that's out of balance, and it's one that if we're going to solve the problems of the system, focusing simply on enforcement or on governance or markets independently of looking at the system as a whole has historically not solved the problem. And so what I'd like you to think about as I talk and perhaps get your input on is ways that we can approach this as a systems problem. So with that, I'll begin. So the global fisheries crisis impacts on marine biodiversity. Very briefly, and many of you knew these numbers, but they bear repeating. 75% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited or overfished. Bycatch, which is the incidental take of non-target species, both fish and other marine species. Just to give you some numbers, 300,000 cetaceans annually caught in fishing gear and dead, 250,000 sea turtles, and 300,000 seabirds. That's 26 species of seabirds, and 17 of which are albatross species that are threatened with extinction as a result of entanglements in fishing gear, specifically long lines. And it's interesting to note that FAO estimates that only 1% of global fisheries are considered to be recovering. So we have a long way to go. Global fisheries benefits, notwithstanding all the problems of biodiversity. World fisheries produced in 1999 about $125 billion in terms of its economic value. It's a primary protein source for 950 million people in the world. Focusing specifically on small-scale fisheries, which represents about 94% of the world's fisheries. It's 50% of the global fish supply for human consumption, coming from small-scale coastal fisheries. Oftentimes we think of the global fishing crisis solely in terms of large-scale boats from distant water fleets from northern countries, and that certainly is an issue, but it also is important to keep in mind that coastal fisheries play an important role not only in the economies of the coastal communities but also in contributing to the system's dysfunction. And you see here also 200 million people worldwide are directly or indirectly employed by fisheries, so it's an important livelihoods issue. Focusing a little bit more on the developing countries' impact on the global seafood market. 50% of all global fish production comes from the developing world. That's about $20 billion in net exports, which is more than rice, coffee, sugar, and tea combined. And in 2004, it contributed 68% of the global non-food fishery exports as well. So these are big numbers, and they're numbers that have been growing, as you can see from the last bullet, that in 1992, the food fishery exports were 43%, increased to 51%. So I'm going to take a minute and explain this slide to you. This was actually a slide that was put together from a number of different resources, thanks to some of my colleagues in our conservation science program. What you see here are three different sets of information. One is gross national income figures from the World Bank, represented here in two colors, which I'm glad they're a little hard to see. They're better on the screen here, but there's the darker color is low income. Those countries that are listed at the bottom of the index for gross national income, and then low to middle income is the lighter yellow color. The blue lines, and that comes from the World Bank, as I said, the blue lines represent a compilation of resources from the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, and WWF, which identify priority areas for biodiversity conservation. And then the third category of data comes from the Sea Around Us project at the University of British Columbia. And what you see there in the colors, the red colors and the green colors, are essentially catch in tons per square kilometer per year, with the red being the highest catch per square kilometer per year. And I think what this map shows, and you can spend a lot of time looking at these maps, and we sort of filtered out some of the information to make it a little simpler. But if you look at Africa, particularly West Africa and Southern Africa, and if you look at Southeast Asia and Asia more generally, you see both the GNI figures showing that low-income countries and low-middle-income countries are also the same countries where biodiversity conservation is a priority, and the catch of fisheries is extremely high. So I think many of us sort of have recognized this overlap. This is just sort of a visual or graphic way to demonstrate it. And over the last 6 or 7 years, the international community has recognized that there is a linkage between overfishing and poverty alleviation. So saving fish and fishers. I stole that from the title of the World Bank's strategic approach paper that came out 3 or 4 years ago, because I think it says it very plainly, and is really what the strategy is of both the World Summit on Sustainable Development and the Millennium Development Goals. These are just a few of the examples of where fisheries are directly linked with poverty and hunger. The MDG 1, talking about gender equity and women's empowerment. That's MDG 3, sorry. And then MDG 7 is environmental sustainability. The WSSD had a number of objectives that were adopted, 2 of which are most relevant for this discussion. Number 1, the goal of reducing overfished fisheries by 50% by 2015 and reducing poverty by 50% by 2015. So with all that in mind, just at the sort of global level, I wanted to give you a couple of statistics on Africa and Southeast Asia. And what you see here in map number 1 is, let me make sure I got my, map number 1 is reliance on fish protein, and as the color gets darker, it demonstrates a higher reliance on fish as a protein source and lower gross domestic product. Okay, so lower income also associated with high use of fish as a primary source of protein. The map on the right, at the same time, shows, again, export of fish as a percentage of total export as compared to the gross domestic product. So you've got 2 maps here. One that shows you that the same places that are relying on fish as a important source of protein also happen to be relying on it as an important part of their export market. And then, of course, which is a little bit harder to see here, but the biodiversity priority areas, which you may recall from the previous map, are indicated by the I guess that's a pink line. Very similar types of maps for Southeast Asia. The first map is really a percentage of the protein-based percentage of protein coming from fish in countries in Southeast Asia. The darker the color, the higher the use of fish as a primary source of protein. And again, map number 2, the export index is basically the same as for Africa. The darker the color, the higher the use of fish as an export commodity, and the lower the gross domestic product. So the next one slide or series of slides I want to show you is just sort of demonstrates graphically again what the fishing pressures problems are in probably biologically speaking one of the most important places in the world, the Coral Triangle in Southeast Asia, for marine biodiversity. In 1950, this basically shows the again catch per ton per kilometer per year, with the darker red color being the highest catch. And this is over. I have three clicks here. The second click is going to show you the difference between 1950 and 1975. If I can go back, so now if you look at it again, it shows you an increase. And I think the next slide is probably the most stunning as compared to 1950. So, well, what does this mean? In the case of Southeast Asia, you have 13 of the top 20 fishing nations in the world. Fish exports contribute up to 99% of total agricultural exports throughout the region. again, thinking back to the map I showed you before, also considering that it's some very low gross domestic product is very low. The GNI index, many of these countries are at the bottom, and the exports are some of the highest. What does it mean for biodiversity? As a result of this increase in fishing pressure, we have over 60% of the coral reefs in Southeast Asia are threatened with overfishing, and over half of those coral reefs are threatened specifically with destructive fishing practices like dynamite fishing. Drilling down a little bit more, and just to give you Indonesia, because it's an important country for a number of reasons in Southeast Asia. 67% of the coral reefs are rated as fair to poor to fair condition, but at the same time, fisheries provide $59.8 billion to the national economy of Indonesia, livelihoods for 2 million people, and it's 53% of the consumed animal protein comes from fish. At the same time, foreign fleets take roughly between 30 and 50% of the total domestic catch in the EEZ, and that number continues to increase. A little bit more specific, with respect to tuna, Japan gets 27% of the catch from Indonesia, and U.S. and Korea get 10% each. So you're beginning to see here some conflicts in the needs of coastal communities and the export market, as well as the fact that we know in many places in Indonesia with a decentralized governance structure, the ability to manage national resources, not to mention international resources, is quite a challenge. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we've been working on with partners that we hope to see over the next 5 to 10 years produce some results that may get at some of these issues. But I'm really interested to hear from you today about ways that we can improve our efforts at collaboration, because I really think, and one of the reasons why we're sitting here with the World Bank and NOAA is that I think we all recognize that to address this issue, we have to sort of look across the system and see who are the kind of key players out there to work with. And clearly the U.S. government and the World Bank are two of the most important. So some of you may be familiar with, about a year or so ago, the Global Environment Facilities Governing Council approved the Strategic Partnership for Sustainable Fisheries Investment Fund in Africa. There was a $60 million commitment by the GEF, which is to be matched about 3-to-1 by the World Bank through their Africa program in loans and grants. The basic purpose of this fund is to allow countries in Africa to apply for loans and grants to essentially do governance reform with the goal of reducing poverty in their country, as well as restoring depleted fish stocks. It's the first partnership and fisheries fund of its kind. The first regional advisory committee meeting, which is led by the African Union, was held last May, in which the first country proposal from Senegal was approved by the Regional Advisory Committee and is now going through the approval process at the World Bank and the GEF. It's a very exciting partnership. It's the first time WWF has partnered with, and I think the first time the World Bank has partnered with WWF and FAO and the African Union on an effort to restore the fisheries of Africa. We hope that it can be a model, but also a learning opportunity to share with other countries and other regions of the world. We're just getting started. I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be actually to get the funding process moving quickly enough so that the funds can be expended. It's only a 10-year period. We're already entering the second year, and only one country has applied. So, again, the challenges of making it through the bureaucratic process, and I don't say bureaucratic in a negative way, but recognizing that big institutions have processes to go through, is going to be a real challenge. So that's just a quick example in Africa. Very different type of example, but one that I think gets to again, focuses on what parts of the system do we need to think about. And my colleague Anita Van Breda is here from WWF, who is the director of our Humanitarian Partnerships program. After the tsunami crisis, we were approached by and worked with the American Red Cross to look at ways to improve on the ways in which rehabilitation of the communities in the region, and particularly in Aceh in this case, could become more sustainable. It was a recognition that prior to the tsunami, the fisheries in Aceh were not necessarily in the best of shape, and the fact that those communities were suffering economically as a result of having weakened fisheries governance. There was obviously a civil war there as well, and produced a situation that made them much more vulnerable to the tsunami. But we're also looking at this in terms of other disasters as well, including civil war. These are just a couple of points. As a result of the tsunami in Aceh province on Sumatra, lost nearly 60% of their productive capacity. 10% of the Aceh fishermen lost their lives in the tsunami. So it was we were essentially almost starting from scratch in many ways, and we began a discussion a little over a year ago with the discussion with the Red Cross started a couple of years ago, but in the development of some green reconstruction guidelines that WWF presented both to the Red Cross and a number of other donor and development organizations. What we tried to do with the Red Cross and FAO is apply those green reconstruction guidelines specifically to improving the livelihoods of fishing communities in Aceh and restoring the fish stocks there. That program was just launched a couple weeks ago with its first regional consultation, where fishing communities, the Pangli Malaut, which are the fishing associations there, the local agencies that manage the fisheries, as well as the national governments and NGOs were present, and there to develop, in essence, a common vision for what their fisheries and their communities in Aceh should look like. Pretty innovative stuff that FAO and Red Cross and WWF are doing together. Again, first time we partnered with the Red Cross and FAO on what is essentially a disaster relief initiative, but it really is more about reconstruction than it is relief. So, and we'd be happy to, Anita's here and she can answer more questions, but there are a lot of other opportunities in the humanitarian sector to look at how fisheries restoration and sustainable fisheries in general can benefit communities after disasters, both natural and otherwise. I'm going to end my PowerPoint just by giving you a quick advertisement. Another kind of interesting project that we started a few years ago. It actually came out of a discussion we were having with cetacean scientists and fishery scientists who typically don't necessarily talk together. The cetacean scientists study small whales and dolphins and porpoises, and the fisheries scientists study fisheries. And so and this was at the urging of both cetacean and fishery scientists, we pulled together a group to talk about what could be done to better understand how to address bycatch in fisheries. And one of the ideas that emerged was encouraging development of alternative technologies. And I'm really pleased to say that after our third year of launching a Smart Gear competition, which is to offer a grand prize to somebody who can come up with the most innovative gear technology, and we have an international panel of judges that judges this, that NOAA Fisheries awarded us one of their Sustainability Leadership Awards. So we're really quite proud of that, and we're proud of it because there's a lot of other people involved in it that make it work. It's not really WWF on its own. It's fisheries science research institutes from Norway to the ITTC to industry representatives in the U.S., New Zealand, Europe. So it really, I think, demonstrates the power of collaboration across sectors. And for those of you who may have an idea, you can see the deadline's July 31st, and there's a $30,000 grand prize, and the money goes to you if you come up with the idea. So I encourage you, if you have an idea, to go ahead and submit it. it's not too late. So actually, I have a couple more slides, and these are sort of works in progress. And this gets at the point I was, am I still okay with time? I should, a couple minutes. Trying to look at a systems approach. And I've spent the last year talking with folks at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Some of you may be familiar with Peter Senge, who is sort of the management scholar who writes about systems analysis and looking at the way that institutions, big corporations, are systems that need to be reformed through a systems analysis, talking about how to apply that systems thinking from a business school to global systems like the global fisheries crisis. And so what I have are two slides that I hope will someday be a little bit more dynamic in terms of the way they interact, but I want to show you the first one, which I would describe to you as the sort of status quo today, and we're calling that the global overfishing cycle. So at the top you see severe market forces, which I think you understood from some of the earlier slides. Weak governance, unsustainable fishing practices result in crashing stocks and habitat destruction, which results in decreased catch per unit effort, which means it makes it tougher on the fishermen to make a living, and it affects the trade, which results in weakened economies, weakened security issues, and threat to livelihoods. What we want to do is figure out how to change this system. And you can imagine if you pick weak governance, for example, and try and reform weak governance, you can still see the market forces having an impact that and oftentimes do today, supersede the benefits that are happening with some governance reform. So what we're suggesting here is that we'd like to have a more systems approach to this and better understand what it is as a system and what makes it function as a system. So if you can imagine this sort of evolving through a series of mouse clicks into the next slide, and I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on ways to sort of describe this into what we would call the sustainable fisheries cycle, where you have positive market forces, strong governance, which results in sustainable fishing practices, which leads to healthy stocks and habitats, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just the beginning, and I'd be curious. We don't have to do it today, but if you have other thoughts on how to better express this, we'd be very interested, because it's. I think it's something that for us to really tackle the global fishing crisis, we need input from Department of Defense, USAID, the private sector, NGOs that are concerned with livelihoods, the humanitarian sector, and a lot of others to really understand how to do this successfully. And I think we'll all benefit from that. So I will stop there and say thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. We're going to turn it over to Kieran.
Yeah, I think it's easier. Look at the lights down. The mic is on? Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center, USAID, and also thank you to Rebecca for helping to chair this meeting. And what I want to talk to you about is I want to try to build some linkages between governance and enforcement, and try to get this done in several ways. Firstly at the national level, and then I'm going to move to West Africa and talk about activities at a regional level, and then I'm going to move a little bit sideways into maritime security and talk a little bit about World Bank activities. And I'm going to move between these different items as we go through the talk. So first of all, I see governance as a key element of the enforcement environment. And at the national level, I want to talk a little bit about policies, about the institutions involved, about effective operational mechanisms, and a little bit about hearts and minds, which is, I guess, something uppermost in people's heads at the moment in relation to security. What does the World Bank say? Well, we have a definition of a definition of governance, and there's an index which ranks countries worldwide in relation to their governance. And I'll be able to show you a little bit later on a relationship between governance and illegal IUU fishing, essentially illegal, unreported and unrecorded fishing. And I want to show a clear linkage between natural resources, management of natural resources, and governance. The bank defines governance as a set of traditions and institutions by which authority is exercised, and it breaks it into the process whereby governments are appointed, the capacity of the government to effectively formulate and implement the policies, and also a key item, I think, the respect of citizens for the state and the institutions, and generally this hearts and minds issue is the third point here. And we'll come back to these several times as we go through the presentation. The bank also talks about several different dimensions of governance, and this is the way it measures governance. It has it builds the index based on these 6 dimensions: voice and accountability, such as things like transparency, the press. Is illegal fishing reported properly in the press? Is there a balanced view in the press and in the public mind? Political stability, obviously, in so many of the developing countries, it's a key element. And in particular, rule of law is a really key one in relation to fisheries enforcement. And much of this information is available on the World Bank's site, this governance site of the World Bank. You can see the country rankings. You can see how this index is built up, and you can see how it's being applied. For example, there's issues about whether you should try to improve or focus on countries with weak governance, or whether you should simply focus on countries with good governance, because the returns on your investment in countries with good governance are higher than those with weak governance. But at the same time, there's a certain rationale for focusing on countries that have very weak governance also, particularly, for example, countries coming out of war situations and so on. So this is really the link between natural resources management and governance and wealth. And a study was done, published, I think about 2 years ago now, by the bank on where is the wealth of nations. And I've just picked up 2 countries out of this, and I just want you to cast your eyes at this table. And you can see here that Switzerland has a very high per capita wealth, Mozambique quite a low one. And this is the division of this wealth between natural resources, the proportion of the wealth, how it's divided up: natural resources, produced capital, that's things like manufacturing, and intangible capital. In Switzerland, the intangible capital is extremely high, whereas in Mozambique it's really quite low. And the process involved in managing the natural resources is really, how do you convert this natural resources wealth, which is pretty high here, into this intangible capital? Now, that's part of this process of enforcement and governance, and putting the mechanisms in place to build wealth, essentially, using an array of instruments. Now, the linkages between the factors explaining this intangible capital are the education level. So obviously you can invest in education, but the other key factor here is the rule of law index, the one coming from the World Bank governance indicators, this rule of law index, which is an extremely strong relationship between this and this intangible capital. So it's clear that in Switzerland people respect the law. They have a high regard for their institutions, and well, there's not very much illegal fishing in Switzerland, but you get the message. So the second item here is policies, and you can see policies are important and they change. Now, I think the policies have to be coherent in content and application. They have to be articulated properly in the legislation, an example is minimum sizes and mesh sizes, for example. Very often there's an incoherence between the two. One law is insisting on certain minimum sizes for landing a fish. Another has measures on mesh sizes, but the two don't make sense. The fishers catch smaller sized fish with the mesh sizes involved. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, and in relation to the discards issue. Clearly, the policies have to articulate with the other sectors, and they would be sectors like the Maritime Security, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And also the policies have to have some level, there has to be a level playing field. People have to see that there's fair play in the policies and the application of the policies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that also. So that in relation to the discards, I'm just going to give you one example here. In Norway, it's prohibited to catch certain species or certain types of fish or sizes. In the European community, just next door or in the contiguous waters, it's prohibited to have on board certain species, for example, over quota. Now, this is just a quotation from the Danish Society for a Living Sea. The Danish skipper was caught with more than 40% of illegal fish on board. And to the media, he said, I was in the Norwegian zone. Because of their discard ban, I had to keep the fish on board. But the Danish ministry then came back and said, the skipper has no excuse for having illegal catch on board. He has to sail into the Danish waters and dump the catch there. You can see the kind of incoherence between these types of policies. Okay, these are two different countries, but it's the same. In many cases, they have shared fisheries. In much of the North Sea, there are shared fisheries on some of these stocks. And this type of policy incoherence has to be resolved in the joint management of fish stocks. Now, this is just showing you some parts of the Bay of Bengal, the coast of the Bay of Bengal, and the small fishers there. Now, I have no particular preference for small scale or large scale, but you can see that there's quite a difference between them. And this shows you the largest vessel in the world, in fact, from my home country in Ireland, although it's recently been sold to Holland. Sorry? The Irish vessel. It's an Irish vessel called Atlantic Dawn. It's the length of one of your football fields here. So it's a fairly large vessel. It was recently sold, but the basic idea is that the owners of this vessel obviously have substantial political power and political access to decision makers, whereas the small fishers that we just saw previously, they have very little power, little empowerment, little access to the political processes which govern their state and their situation of poverty. And it's important that they are organised and have this, and that the policies facilitate this facilitate equity and the division of the allocation of the fish resources. Otherwise, you get a continued imbalance. Okay, now I just want to move to this hearts and minds, and this is Gandhi here, and this is the governor. So you have two real approaches here. You have a discursive approach, which is Gandhi's approach, I guess, and a coercive approach, which our friend below is well known for. Maybe not in real life, but at least in the films. And the two approaches have different cost structures and different philosophies behind them. So that the kind of equipment in one is fairly simple, and in the other it's more robust and more there's more of an enforcement element in it, if you like. And they also have different levels of technologies also. I'm not saying that all discursive efforts are around under the palm tree or in the village, but I think you get the message here. And clearly our task is to try to find the right balance between these discursive and coercive approaches. So we have, in many cases, we have to change the mentality involved. This is a process which takes time. It takes many years. For example, I think one of my colleagues, Michael Arbuckle, is going to speak. Maybe he's speaking today or tomorrow. He will tell you that in New Zealand, for example, in the moving of the mines, it took them 20 years to build some of these structures, these rights-based fishery structures. So it takes time, and I think a key thing is to be able to identify the process involved. How do we get from A to B? What are the steps involved? We can't do it overnight, but we have to move the pieces into place. The legal structures, perhaps the education of the people, building of knowledge, the science about the fisheries. And this has to be done fairly gradually. And I think the key thing is to identify the process and how we can manage this process, and to recognize that it's going to take time, it's going to take a lengthy period. But the results will be that there will be probably lower costs in a more effective system, and it will function in a more effective manner. So let's just move briefly to the effectiveness of different mechanisms and different systems. And this is just some illustrations here. There are high costs of much of the compliance and much of the enforcement systems. For example, it's 50-60% of total fisheries management costs in the USA. About 14% of the value of US commercial landings is invested in management of different descriptions. There's also substantial cost to fishers. The more regulations you put in place, the higher the costs can often be to fishers, unless these regulations are very well designed, and preferably designed in cooperation with the fishers. And also there's not only the operating costs of, say, changing into new nets if you change mesh sizes, but also the social costs of if regulations are maybe controversial. Fishers tend to watch each other. There tends to be suspicion among fishers that some of them are having illegal landings, others are not. Also, there's similar costs in places like Norway. 7 to 15% of the landed value is invested in management. There's also, generally, there's low probability of detection and low probabilities of penalties. And in many of the EC countries, for example, this probability is less than 10% of 1%. And it's regarded simply as a cost of doing business. The fines and so on are so low that the fishers basically ignore the fines and ignore some of the enforcement mechanisms. So that unless the fishing communities are brought on side, unless they're really supporting these management mechanisms, your chances of coercing them into doing so are fairly limited. How can effectiveness be improved? Well, I think there's a whole range of mechanisms, and I'm not going to really go into them, but certainly proper planning. You can look at things like HACCP systems. In other words, you have choke points like ports, it's more cost effective to monitor at ports. You have to do at-sea monitoring and surveillance, but it's a very costly business, and any way you can reduce this cost is of value. In the developing countries, in particular, the recurrent costs of particularly of the monitoring, control, and surveillance systems are crippling. In many cases, the projects put in large, sophisticated equipment and systems, but the available budgets, the recurrent budgets, are insufficient to support that. And many of these costs are not internalized. In other words, they're not internalized. In other words, the fishing industry does not pay for this. Discursive approaches, as I mentioned, is clearly an effective approach, and also targeting chronic violators. And much of this is done in the United States, but in developing countries it's not so common. Now, let me move to the West Africa story, and the area I'm going to talk about is the Sub-Regional Fisheries Commission area. It stretches from Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And you can see even here in Liberia, for example, there's almost no control at the moment. It's a state that's just coming out of war. Even the port and so on is not really functioning properly there. And I'm going to talk about several different items here: the knowledge and the approach involved, the institutions that have been built or been in the process of being built there, the cooperative mechanisms in the area, a little bit about cost effectiveness, and a little bit about linking to what Tom has mentioned already about the bank and donor operations there. And you can see that this is a very interesting coastline. Here you have Nouadhibou, which is one of the main ports here. Here's the Banque d'Arguin, which is a world, I think it's a World Heritage site. It's a major biodiversity site. This is Dakar. The port of Dakar is just here. And then you have the Gambia River, the Casamance, and just out of picture you have the area of Guinea-Bissau, which is a major nursery area. Many of the species in the area complete their life cycles in this area. And out here you have the Cape Verde Islands, which are also part of this sub-regional fisheries commission. Now, it's not a management commission; it's a cooperative mechanism. It's not managing joint stocks like ICAT or many of the regional fisheries management organizations. Okay, so the status, well, the annual value of the catch is roughly 2.5 billion, but only about 25% of that is actually captured by the economies of these West African countries. In terms of the illegal fishing operations, about the results of aerial surveillance in the region show that about 15% of the sightings are of illegal vessels, either fishing without a license or they're in a zone which is not a protected zone or whatever. And the estimated value of I'll call it illegal fish for one, or illicit fish for want of a better word, is about 0.4 billion a year. And just to give you an idea of the types of violations, here you have in the case of Guinea, about 92% of the vessels are found with the illegal trawl mesh. In Senegal, 51% of the violations are prohibited zone violations. In other words, the industrial vessels, and this is all referring to industrial vessels, or at least this table here is referring to industrial vessels, this part of the table. In other words, the industrial vessels are encroaching into the artisanal zones or into protected zones. And in many cases, you have a lack of timely and applied scientific information. And I've seen some of the ministries or departments where you have logbooks stacked to the roof, but you don't really know what the catch was last year because the logbooks still haven't been analysed or assessed. So that in something like a shrimp fishery or a cephalopod fishery, this information is needed on a month-by-month basis. You need to have a regular tracking of what's going on in the fishery. It's not a question of just having a historical view, because it's a kind of hands-on, month-to-month management decisions may be required. Now, this strange graph is actually of the French fleet, and it shows the vessel. It graphs the vessel tonnage against the length of the vessel in the French fleet, and this one shows the Asian fleets operating in the region, or a section of the Asian fleets, and you can see the difference. In other words, here the larger vessels have a lower tonnage. And this is an implication. This is the reported tonnage, I might say, because the fishing license fees are calculated on the tonnage of the vessel very often. And the average underestimate in Guinea is about 48%. Guinea-Bissau alone lost about an estimated 1 million a year in the year in question that we were looking at this. So, again, the knowledge of the vessels, of the types of vessels operating, the exact characteristics of these vessels is important for gauging the amount of effort, for example, going on, because clearly the effort measurement in this case is totally out of line with reality. Okay, again, moving back to this hearts and minds, you might think this is strange to talking about parking fines, but some of you may have seen this particular article. And what it says is that the UN diplomats in New York are exempt from fines. So there's no deterrence on parking tickets. In the case of the UK, Switzerland, Canada, they have no parking tickets. Russia has 30,000 parking tickets outstanding. Chad, Nigeria, and some of the Middle Eastern countries have also the highest parking tickets outstanding. And there's a direct correlation between the parking tickets in this and the World Bank governance score. So, again, we have to look on, when we're talking about fishing rights and rights-based fishing, we have to talk about rights. Okay, you have the rights to fish, but also there's an obligation not to abuse those rights. And the two really go hand in hand. And maybe we should talk about obligation-based fishing rather than rights-based fishing sometimes, I think. Okay, again, coming back to this governance gap and illicit fishing activities. Globally, it's been estimated by a study done by the UK that it's around 9 billion a year, and it undermines the profits of the good fishers, undermines rule of law. In many cases, particularly in West Africa, it's an offshore economy. The vessels are flagged in one place, they're owned in another, insured in a third, chartered in somewhere else. The profits go to another country, and the captain is from another country again. So it's very difficult to keep track of this. It's not petty theft, it's highly profitable, it's organised crime. There are organised laundries to move the fish from one place to the other. There are strong links with anti-corruption, with money laundering, with tax evasion and transfer pricing in many cases. And in the case of this, of the links between, on this study, this study I referred to done by the UK, there's this close correlation between the level of IUU fishing and the World Bank's governance indicators. In fact, you can see the correlation coefficient is pretty high. So this corruption and overfishing are really linked. It's essentially that votes are often bought with political capital. In other words, too many licenses are issued for political gain, maybe not monetary gain. It perpetuates the decline of the fisheries. It perpetuates this inability to generate the surplus and create the wealth. In other words, as long as this overfishing continues, you don't have a surplus and you can't create this intangible wealth. You can't reinvest it in things like education and things like the rule of law, building this rule of law. It's undermining the whole process of creating wealth. So essentially converting this natural capital into intangible capital in terms of human capital, in terms of the institutions that support it. So corruption is really a key block on the system in many of these developing countries. So let me just talk about the cooperation in the region. There's been a series of projects since the 1990s. Firstly, the legal frameworks were established through a European Commission-funded project, a European Community-funded project. And secondly, there was Luxembourg and Germany finance projects both in the region and in certain countries. And they shared the surveillance assets. They shared aerial surveillance, and then they shared maritime surveillance. They also built databases and communications links, which worked partially, but not very well in some cases. But a key item was that there were protocols and joint operations put together. In other words, there were protocols on, say, hot pursuit. There were protocols on joint surveillance. In other words, let's say the patrol vessel from Senegal could enter into the waters of Guinea or Guinea-Bissau with inspectors from those countries on board. And when the vessel entered those waters, the inspector from those particular countries became the chief of the vessel, but for the purposes of the surveillance and the fishing arrests and so forth, he became the leader of the vessel, the captain or in charge of the vessel. Now we're in a third phase. The European Commission, Germany, France, and possibly the World Bank are coming into the picture. And that refers essentially to the project that Tom was talking about, that there's funds coming from GEF and possibly what we call regional funds from the bank also. And what are the lessons from this project? Well, or from this series of projects. Firstly, that even though the political instability continues to undermine good governance. In Guinea, we have problems right now. Guinea-Bissau, there's also been a number of problems. The illegal fishing is essentially migrated from Senegal, Mauritania, and so forth down into places like Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau. So those countries with the weakest governance, that's where the illegal fishing has migrated to. Also, the fishers have migrated partly because of overfishing, so that we have Senegalese fishers fishing all the way down to Gabon. And here you have communities of fishers from Senegal fishing the whole length of this coast, and also fishing up into Mauritania. And this also has been creating a number of border incidents, of difficulties among the fishing communities. Trade has certainly expanded, as Tom was saying, but trade has had. And let me just take the example of Senegal. In value terms, the Senegal's trade with the European community is high. But in volume terms, most of the fish is actually going to Africa. So the cheap fish, in other words, the bycatch, what was perhaps previously discarded, is now going to the African urban markets in places like Nigeria. Nigeria alone imports about 750,000 tons of fish, and it's the lowest value protein in the country. This is mainly small pelagics rather than trawl bycatch, but nevertheless, it's significant movement of fish between African countries, and particularly to the urban centres. Nevertheless, this international cooperation has continued despite weak institutions and despite some tensions involved. But also because of the overexploitation, fishers have turned to this human trafficking, and there's been a major traffic in human traffic between Senegal, Mauritania, that area of coast, and the Canary Islands. Okay, so what's the bank doing? Well, right now we're putting together a project on port state measures, selecting particular ports. In fact, it would be Dakar and one in Mauritania. We're doing a re-estimate of the estimate of IUU fishing, which the UK initially did in West Africa. We have projects and initiatives in most of the countries I've spoken about. We're trying to build this regional project for West Africa, and that's at the concept stage. And in fact, some of my colleagues will be going to Senegal. I think it's it's the week after next, to have a discussion with all the countries involved. This project would link to this GEF, the LME, the Large Marine Ecosystem Projects in Africa, which Tom spoke about recently. And we're also looking at trying to launch an irresponsible vessel list with IUCN. Again, let me move briefly to the area of maritime security in general. And I just want to point out two items here, that the marine tourism in this projection, and this is a projection I just want to point out, is more or less equivalent to fisheries. So that we have to think beyond fisheries in terms of just catching the fish and using it for food. That there's a lot more going on here in the marine sector, and we have to think in a broader way, perhaps, if we're going to tackle some of the issues involved. This again is from West Africa, from Mauritania, and it's really this maritime security and this enforcement issue. And much of this is just common sense, that there's common issues and synergies between many of the items we're talking about: fisheries, drugs, immigration, customs, marine pollution, money laundering, corruption, and so forth. And we have to try to use make effective use of the assets and the capacity. I just want to briefly refer to some new cost-effective technologies that can be used, and give one or two examples of that. And again, come back to regional cooperation very, very briefly. This is a project that was run by the European community. It's called the IMPAS project, and it's on a synthetic aperture radar. And this shows the North Atlantic Ocean, and this is the Icelandic zone. And you can see this is the images picked up by this synthetic aperture radar. And on the next slide, you can see they've overlaid this with the VMS information, the vessel tracking information from the satellite systems, and they can identify which vessels are reporting, which vessels are not. So you can see that these Russian vessels are just all outside the edge of the zone, and some of the Icelandic vessels are inside. So it can be a very accurate and very useful tool, and it's becoming a more and more cost-effective tool. And certainly it's something that can be looked at in more detail, not for individual developing countries, but for groups of developing countries, perhaps. And I just want to give you one more example of this, and this is Kerguelen Island. This is in the Southern Ocean. It's a French possession down there. And the French were losing about 60 million euro a year in the toothfish fishery down there. And they put in this synthetic aperture radar with the patrol vessels, of course, and at a cost of about 2 million euro per year, and essentially saved this loss of fish. And 90% of the illegal fishing disappeared, and the costs are shared with Australia, that has possessions down in the Southern Ocean also. Let me turn briefly to another area, and this, you know well, is the Caribbean. And here, fishing is really a minor activity in most cases. Cruise ships and tourism are considerably more important. Safety at sea is important, tourism, weather prediction, drugs and customs are important, and there's a very strong case for regional initiatives and the sharing of assets in this region. So what would you look at in a Caribbean package? Well, you need a minimum institutional framework, some kind of sub-regional convention and permanent working group as a minimum. You need to integrate the control for cost effectiveness between fisheries, tourism, shipping and so forth, and preferably have multilateral or bilateral arrangements to conduct joint surveillance, hot pursuit, share intelligence and so forth. And preferably all the countries in the region should be members of the different regional fisheries management organizations, so they're talking the same language and in the same fora. And if you were putting a system together, you'd probably look at shared use of high-tech tools and satellite science, both for control purposes, but also simply for scientific purposes, and build on the existing Coast Guard and security arrangements in the region. So in conclusion, for us in the World Bank, fisheries is really a new area, and we're moving from development, in other words, we were putting in ports and fishing fleets before, to the management of sustainable fisheries. We have fairly limited coverage and limited technical capabilities, so we need formal and informal partnerships with a range of other actors in the area. Our focus is essentially on governance and poverty, and we are facing major political and social and technical challenges. And the solutions for us are partly outside the sector. We can't just live within the fishery sector. We have to move into the areas of justice, of law, of governance, of financial management, for the macroeconomic management in some countries. And in this relation, the bank has some strategic advantage. We don't necessarily have the technical advantages that many of you people in the room have. We do have a strategic advantage in talking on a broader framework within a country context. And, well, this is just a parting slide. It's all a matter of an enabling environment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom and Kieran, for excellent presentations. It's a lot to chew on. Rebecca, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It is indeed an honor to be a discussant. The presentations by Tom and Kieran. I thought I'd just use 1 minute of my precious 10 minutes to tell you a couple of interesting factoids about these two gentlemen, just so that you know they have a life beyond their daily jobs. Tom is a big fan of poetry, and in fact, he ran out of time, but he wanted to end his talk with a Walt Whitman poem about Menhaden fishermen. So maybe if we have time at the wrap-up, you could do your poem. And Kieran is an excellent champion swimmer. He swam from Alcatraz to the Golden Gate Bridge. How many miles is that?
Not very far.
Yeah.
About a mile and a half.
Yeah, just a mile and a half. Okay, be a little too far for me to swim, so bravo. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about what's going on at home. We're looking a lot at what's going on outside, but at NOAA Fisheries, we are also responsible for what's going on at home. How are we doing? You probably read some of the sad news in the paper. I think we're making some progress. Not all of our fishing stocks, nor our protected stocks, are assessed. Of the ones that are assessed, we do have overfished stocks and we do have overfishing still going on. Most of the stocks that are overfished, we have rebuilding programs in place. There is a website where you can get more information about this. We still have a problem with overfishing. In principle, you can stop overfishing overnight, right? You have to go through a regulatory process in the U.S., which takes a while. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, the new Magnuson-Stevens Act, tells us we have to stop it within 2 years. So you will see a flurry of regulatory activity in the coming years. Another important thing to point out in the United States is we are huge consumers of seafood. We export about $1 billion, and we import about $9 billion worth of fish. A lot of that is farm fish. But whether it's farmed or whether it's wild caught, we have a responsibility as consumers to know what's going on out there. I always liken this to the drug trade. You know, in the United States, if we're using all these illegal drugs, then we certainly are part of the problem, a huge part of the problem. This is interesting because you brought up the idea of severe market forces, Tom, and so we want to come back to that. I do want to mention, and I left a one-page summary out front of the Magnuson-Stevens Reauthorization Act, which we call MISRA, as in Les Miserables. One of the interesting parts about this new Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is our big fisheries legislation in the United States, it has a huge section this time around on international fisheries. And indeed, it says we are supposed to produce a report in January of '09 where we're identifying the countries that are engaged in IUU fishing or bycatch. We're supposed to work with these other countries, supposed to work multilaterally to the extent that we can. If those things don't work out, we are supposed to impose trade measures, trade sanctions, and ban the imports. So if we do that, is that a positive market force, Tom, or is it a negative market force? We need to think about that. It's more fish for folks to eat at home, but maybe they wouldn't go fishing for that particular species if they can't get the export price for it. I also want to mention the MCS network, Monitoring, Control, and Surveillance. Dale Jones, Chief Jones, you still here? Yeah, there's Dale. Dale is the chair, and NOAA is hosting this. This is an informal network that is part of our MISRA obligations as well. And it has to do with a voluntary network of enforcement agents around the world. For our speakers, I think the message overall is we do need to take a holistic approach. There's a lot more to the picture than just fishing. Everything is linked. I appreciate Kieran having the courage to link it with organized crime. I was just telling my colleagues from NOAA on the way down here, you get a little nervous when you read about organized crime and how ugly and vicious it can be. Is it dangerous for us to be in fisheries management? I can imagine in some parts of the world, even close to home, there can be a problem. And the link with human trafficking. There are cases of indentured servitude on fishing boats on the high seas. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Links with drugs, etc. So if in the true ecosystem approach to stewardship, you really have to look at the bigger picture. Now let me just raise a couple questions to get the discussion going. I think one of the big challenges here is coordinating all the work that's going on. There's a number of institutions just in this room alone. The U.S. Navy folks are here, the AID folks, World Bank, WWF, a lot of people engaged in this work in other countries. How do we coordinate that? And how do we coordinate it with the governance measures in place? How do we let someone know that at an ICAT meeting, which is the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, that one country insisted on measures that were, we thought, unsustainable? And how do we get that message back through? We want all countries to be participating, but we want that participation to reflect the science and take the kind of stand that we think is important. So how do we get this coordination to go? I think the World Bank might be a good opportunity to kind of funnel all that, and the bank goes to one country and find out who all, not just in the U.S. too, it's all the other countries and all the other bodies out there. Also, as I said, what is the potential impact of trade measures? Because not just in the United States, but also in a lot of RFMOs, the regional fishery management organizations, there's an increasing use of trade tracking measures as a way to sort of ground truth what's really going on in fishing, but also as a way to punish member countries and non-member countries. Just, we're going to ban your trade. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? When you think about a developing country, is that a good thing? Is that going to make it happen, or is that just going to shift where the product? Is that going to break your link of bad market forces, as you mentioned, Tom? A good versus weak governance. Kieran pointed that out. Should you go and work in those countries or not? And I think whether you have good or weak governance, one of the things that's really important, and we think about this in the United States, is how are we going to put measures in place that are pretty easy to enforce? We have the whole gamut in the United States. We have everything from the most complex days at sea thing in New England with different number of days at sea for each boat, so they got to phone in when they leave and phone when they come back, and to ITQ, individual transferable quota type measures, which have been shown to be less costly in terms of enforcement. But it's useful, and it'd be good for the discussion to focus on what are some measures that are more enforceable than others. Is it easier to enforce a time area closure? The IETTC, which is the Eastern Tropical Pacific Tuna Organization, they like to use time area closure. Okay, everybody has to stop fishing 2 months out of the year. It's pretty simple. It's pretty neat. If you see one of their boats out there, they're busted. As opposed to quotas, which, as we've seen in ICAT, which is some people also refer to as the international conspiracy to catch all the tunas, you can see that there are a number of countries, both reporting and not reporting, who are going way over their quota. So would it be better just to say nobody fishes 2 months out of the year? So think about that in terms of how do we find enforceable measures that anybody can implement. Low cost, low tech. And finally, I'll just leave with you the idea of incentives. I think both of you talked about that. How do we get incentives to work? One way is to make measures market-based, and another way is trade sanctions, type of penalties, that kind of thing. So those are some ideas to get the juices flowing and get the discussion going. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all three. We're going to take a couple questions at a time here. So put your hand in the air. I'll call you out. And remember to say your name and your affiliation into the microphone so we can capture it for our video. In the back there.
Harlan Cohen, IUCN World Conservation Union. Not really a question, just a comment on the last. As a start, I think we could do better with transparency in the regional fisheries management organizations. We really need to move to a system where their meetings are open, where their documents are available online, where the reports are easily, quickly available online. This would not of itself improve the fisheries status, but it would allow the world community to see what's happening, and that, I think, in turn would help. Just to start. Thanks.
Okay, and just pass it over a couple people there.
Thank you. Fraser McGilvery from Conservation International. I have a question which is actually for Tom to do with Aceh. And I'm just wondering how you feel about the situation there now, where fishing capacity is actually greater now than it was pre-tsunami, and any fisherman or anyone who says they were a fisherman for $10 can get a boat from a developing agency and go and fish, and what the implications of that, how you see that progressing.
Okay, and I think is there, and just there in the back as well, one more.
Hi, Garrick Louis from University of Virginia. I just wondered, and I came in late, so if you address this, excuse me. To what extent is the impact on fisheries driven by industrial, international type operations as opposed to local, small-scale fisheries? Thanks.
Okay, if you guys just want to take turns.
Sure. Maybe with respect to the question on Aceh, I think that's exactly the problem that's been identified in Aceh, is that before there was an opportunity to really come back with a governance system that would allow for better management. You saw, and this was in many instances well intentioned to allow the fishermen to go back to work. I have not seen any hard data there. I've heard a lot of similar anecdotal evidence that suggests that in a number of instances there were additional boats, motors, etc., that were provided. I don't know, Anita. I don't know if you had any more detail on that, but the problem does exist. Whether or not there's more boats than there was before, there were too many boats then. So, and the problem was there was a lack of good management and not really good cooperation between the government institutions and the local fishing associations, which actually have a fairly sound. And I have to mention that USAID funded a workshop with the Pangy Laut that actually came up with a very nice management plan that was based in their local customs and laws. And in that part of Sumatra, they are in many instances governed by Sharia. And if there's actually a wonderful graphic in the USAID report that shows the way in which the local fishermen association views the way that their local customs and laws are really the enabling context for the way that they should be working with local institutions. So the purpose of the FAO Red Cross Fisheries project that we're advising Red Cross on is to create a governance system that addresses whatever the fishing capacity is currently, and it's going to take some time. So, with respect to the question about the problem, I think earlier in my PowerPoint we indicated that a vast majority of the fisheries in the world are coastal fisheries. I think it was over 90%. But you do have a great impact in a number of well, in almost all of the developing world by distant water fleets from the north and Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Korea. So there's not one sector that's a problem, but they all contribute to the problem and have to be part of the solution. So.
Yeah, just responding to Harlan's question about the transparency of the RFMOs. There's a high-level task force which is producing a report on best practices in RFMOs and the management of RFMOs at the moment. I think Harlan is aware of this. It's under the chairmanship of Michael Lodge, whom some of you know. And I think it's funded by Canada, Australia, and several in UK and several others. And this will have a very useful body of descriptions of best practice and recommendations when it's finally published. An initial offering was made at the recent COFI meeting in Rome, but I think the final report and the annexes in particular will be of very great value to everybody. On the question of small scale and large scale, there isn't much in the way of comparative studies that I know of. I know of one in particular which was interesting from the Philippines, where trawling was compared to an array of small-scale fishing operations, and it found, in fact, that in terms of biodiversity, the small-scale fishing operations were impacted more on biodiversity than shrimp trawling, mainly because the shrimp trawlers couldn't get into some of the areas, whereas the small-scale fishers exploited all the different niches that were available. But we're also doing a study in association with FAO and World Fish Centre on estimating the relative footprints, if you like, of small-scale and industrial fisheries at a global level. Now, most of this is focused on Southeast Asia and East Asia, but it will be a global study, and this will be coming out. I think a preliminary report will be ready in the next few months, and the final report probably sometime later in the year. And this will update some of the, for example, some of the figures that were given earlier on the dimensions of numbers of people involved in fishing worldwide, because many of these figures are actually quite old, dating from well back into the 80s and 90s. So that we're really trying to update the global estimates of numbers of fishers involved, the amounts of fish being caught by industrial and small-scale fishing, and so forth. So hopefully within the next 6-8 months, we'll have a much better answer on this. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question and a good point that Karen's making. I'm glad we're working on assessing that impact. I think we tend to go after the fisheries where we have a lot of information, such as the high seas pelagic longline fishery tends to be countries that are providing data and information and participating in the RFMOs. But in fact, there is evidence, and hopefully we can quantify it, of impact particularly on marine mammals and sea turtles from inland fisheries, small-scale fisheries. So it'd be good to get a sense of what the dimensions of the problems are. Thanks.
Any other questions? Up here in the front. Just wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I hate to sound like such Matteo Malazzo, NMFS. Thanks, Mark. I hate to sound so gloomy, but it strikes me, listening to Karen and picking up some of the points and questions that Rebecca posed, that this is a problem whose magnitude and complexity is perhaps beyond the reach of government. When you look at how poor a job the European countries are doing with their fines and penalties, when you look at IUU, I could go on and on. It strikes me that perhaps the best way to go is to look at ways in which we can work with industry to alter the incentives. Rebecca mentioned incentives. I have in mind rights-based management, in which the producers have an incentive in preserving the resource. I have in mind certification systems in which producers and buyers have an interest, a monetary interest, in ensuring the sustainability of the product they're selling. And picking up on Rebecca's question, perhaps we ought to think about managing in ways other than through tax and bycatch quotas, which are extremely difficult, which mean getting on board a boat and looking at the catch and figuring out what it is and where it was caught. I mean, there is a body of opinion. I mean, this is controversial, but there is a body of opinion according to which effort-based management does make sense and does work. And things like area closures and mesh regulations do make sense because they are easier to enforce, whereas quotas, targeted quotas, bycatch quotas, are very difficult to enforce. So the message, or this is my reaction to these presentations, is I'm not entirely convinced what government can do, individually or collectively, and I think we ought to look at ways in which we reach out to the users to get them to help us.
There's a question just right up here as well, Sharon.
Hi, Nicola Befnoa, Fisheries. In listening to the presentations, I really expected to hear more about the MCS network, monitoring, control, and surveillance. And it wasn't until Dr. Lent brought it up that it even entered the conversation. And I'm wondering what the gulf there is and whether or not the MCS network as it exists today is serving these priority regions in the cases that you've described in some of those situations, or whether it's just not applicable given the nature of the fisheries that you're working on, if there's something that can be done to tie that network together with the situations that you guys are dealing with.
And just right next.
Tim Resch, USAID. I wanted to ask about the tuna treaty. I guess it's like $17 million the State Department provides to Pacific Island nations for, I guess, improved tuna management activities, and whether or not that subsidy is related to the how cheap tuna is for us here in the United States and such. I don't really understand too much. When I saw it, I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting.
Yes, okay. Firstly, on the MCS network, I think we're very aware of the network, and certainly I was involved or had a lot of dialogue with Michelle Currick over the past years on this, and I think we're particularly interested in having this global list of irresponsible vessels being hosted by the MCS network. But the MCS network is still a project. It doesn't have a legal persona at the moment, so it's a little bit difficult to work with the MCS network unless you're actually involved directly in MCS work. Now, I did have a discussion in the past about trying to get say regional cells established, because a global network is a little difficult to manage, but regional cells might be more efficient and more effective. On Mateo's question, is it beyond governments? Well, I'm afraid governments are all we have, really. We have the fishers and the governments and the consumers. So maybe between us, we have to manage in some way. But also, I think there's an illusion of management. We're not really managing. We're sort of stumbling forward a little bit, because we don't have control over all the different items. So that we call it fisheries management, but it's not really management as such. It's a process of putting together measures and negotiating measures, and we're working in I think we have to identify manageable units. In the case of the European fisheries, that's been a constant problem. The units are not manageable units. There's an incoherency of units. There's EEZs are overlapping with quota areas, with restricted areas, with ICES regions, and so forth. So that the units in that case are not manageable, and it's proved particularly intractable in terms of the rights involved, which are applied to the different regions also. And in this context, when you're creating manageable units, there's a cost of maintaining that boundary, and that links back to the rights issues. That if you have rights over fisheries all over the world, it's much more difficult to manage that unit or that group of vessels if they can move everywhere. If they're restricted, okay, there's a cost involved in restricting them to a certain area, but it becomes more manageable. So there's some kind of a trade-off in terms of, I guess, for want of a better word, it's systems theory. There's a cost in maintaining boundaries, and you have to try to find the boundaries that are most cost-effective, essentially. On the tax and bycatch quotas, I think you have good examples here, for example, in Alaska, which has been working fairly well in some of these areas. And on the tuna treaty, I'm not entirely familiar with the more recent developments, but certainly I think the production of tuna, the U.S. is a fairly minor player in global production of tuna, so the elements of the tuna treaty may not necessarily affect global tuna prices as such. And I mean, when we talk about tuna, there's a whole range of different species also, so it's difficult to just bundle them all into one term as tuna. There's many different fisheries, many different species, and many different types of prices. And the structure of the industry also plays a very major role in determining prices. That it's not an open and free market as one might think by just the price trends that are reported. There's a lot of restrictions in who can sell to whom. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just picking up where Karen left off on the tuna treaty. At least our view of what it's an access agreement actually between the United States and 14 Pacific Island countries, which essentially allows the United States vessels to fish in their waters. Last I heard, the treaty allowed 42 vessels, but there are currently only 11 vessels fishing there. What's important, at least from my perspective, about having the U.S. engaged in that fishery, which is some people will describe as the last great tuna fishery in the world. The vessels that the U.S. vessels fish mostly skipjack, if not entirely skipjack. They're purse seine vessels, but that is about half the world's supply of canned tuna comes from the Central and Western Pacific Ocean. It's a big fishery. It's the last reasonably healthy stock of yellowfin and big eye tuna. And the U.S. has historically provided played a very important leadership role in the establishment of the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. I would dare say that if the U.S. didn't have that economic interest there, frankly, albeit small, and a real understanding of how the economics of that fishery operates, as well as the geopolitical aspects of that fishery operates, it would be very difficult for the U.S. to continue to play that role. Now, whether or not the U.S. fleet continues to fish there or not, the U.S. has established an important role there, and as a result, we have a treaty that was written and adopted a number of years ago and is now finally moving forward with actually management measures. We have a treaty that is really pretty much state-of-the-art. It's the first big treaty that was adopted after the Fish Stocks Agreement was adopted in 1995. And the U.S. Should be, frankly, proud that they played a pretty significant role when the other big fishing nations were probably the most difficult opponents of it. And Japan actually walked out at the last round of the negotiations, and they are a huge player in the region, as you can imagine. So. Anyway, that's just a quick my view on the tuna treaty. Absolutely, government can't do it alone. The NGO community can't do it alone, and frankly, the private sector can't do it alone either. And I think collaboration on certification schemes is an important issue for WWF. We helped to establish the Marine Stewardship Council with Unilever, which at the time was the world's largest purchaser of fish. And those sorts of efforts are very important. And I don't think people should feel as though just because government can't solve all the problems, it doesn't mean that government still needs to continue to play an important role. And particularly here in the United States, that's definitely the case. I think one of the lessons we've learned about carrying experiences from the United States to other parts of the world is that we have to recognize that there's different cultural, political, and social contexts that we need to translate our experiences with success and failures in a way that actually informs them and helps them improve their fisheries. And the example I'll just give you is, I think the Coast Guard has estimated their annual budget's about $8 billion. So the types of things you talk about in terms of enforcement, MCS, all that kind of stuff that works here in the United States because we have those sorts of resources, they don't work in coastal East Africa, where last I heard the count of patrol boats that they had in Mozambique were Mozambican waters, which, if I had to guess, it's almost half the coastline is almost half the length of the eastern seaboard. Here, they have 3 vessels. So we have to think of different ways. We're not gonna move a whole navy over there, and they're not going to build a navy. If they're going to build boats, they're probably going to build fishing boats first. So we just have to be a little bit more creative about how we address these issues in the developing world context. So thank you.
Creativity is my point. I think it takes partnerships. Tom, you mentioned a number of partnerships in your presentation. Right here in the United States, the Nature Conservancy Environmental Defense partnered with a group of fishermen in California, and in exchange for a buyout that they funded, the Fishery Management Council agreed to a time area closure to protect the area from bottom trawling. So I think we have to look at novel and creative approaches. We haven't talked a lot about fishing capacity, which is one of the problems that leads to IUU fishing. Sometimes developed countries will have buyouts and then dump their boats on the world market, and that results in a lot of IUU fishing. It can be a problem. Could we use those boats to become patrol boats? Some of these football field-sized boats, could they become patrol boats? We have to think creatively. What are some of our options out there?
Thank you very much for those answers. Any more questions? Karen, right there in the back.
Hi, Dale Jones with NOAA Fisheries. I would just be curious from your research and backgrounds how you would characterize the overall impact of the consumption by developed countries on this entire problem. In other words, how much does that specific area contribute to the 75% number that Tom mentioned earlier in terms of overfished and exploited stocks?
And in the back again, Karen.
Hi, I'm Kara Honzak from WWF. I work a lot on small-scale fisheries, and I'm not a fisheries expert. In fact, I come from the health side, and we do a lot of reproductive health and population work in areas where they're trying to improve management of fisheries. And it strikes me that the conversation we've had today has not really emphasized that much what to do about small-scale fisheries and the enabling environments that we need to create to improve management of those fisheries. And I was just wondering, I was really interested in the idea of the intangible capital. It's a very abstract idea, but if you could offer a few concrete examples of where you've seen successful efforts to tap into intangible capital in relation to fisheries management, I'd really be interested in hearing about those and perhaps some examples of scaling that up for community-based fisheries. Thank you.
And right behind Karen, one more.
Hi, my name is Monica Tila with NOAA, the National Marine Sanctuary Program. Tom, question for you. You mentioned talking about green construction guidelines and sort of guidelines and improvements for alternative livelihoods. I was curious whether you could talk a little bit more about that and an example of that perhaps, and whether there have been any correlations shown with providing alternative livelihoods and reducing fishing pressure in that area.
Okay, let's take these questions.
Well, Dale, just to maybe, I'm not sure I can answer your question too directly, but I think what you saw in my PowerPoint presentation really showed that they're both export as well as local consumption issues currently as the two big issues. One of the reasons why export is there is because in many parts of the north we've overfished our stocks to a point where you have European vessels and to a lesser extent U.S. vessels, obviously, but other vessels going to catch fish in other places. So I'm not sure that it necessarily helps to say who's eaten more fish, because I think what Kieran pointed out was that actually as a matter of volume in Africa, Africa was West Africa was taking more fish, but in the category of discards and bycatch, but that the higher value fish is going to the export market, and so they're both a problem. I wouldn't necessarily want to pick one as being worse than the other, just because I'm not sure it really leads us to a discussion that would get at what the problem is. And I think particularly in Senegal is a great example, you have a big commercial artisanal fleet, which catches about 80% of the fish that are caught in Senegalese waters, and so 20% of the fish is caught by distant water fleets. You have to manage both of those fleets, and they have to be managed together. There are conflict issues, but it's more about sustainability. There are bycatch issues with the artisanal fleet that don't exist with the distant water fleets. But if you manage the export market so that the resources actually go to the country to better manage their own resources, that to me is what you're looking to do. But what we currently have now with the way that fish are caught by distant water fleets, the revenue doesn't go. The real revenue doesn't go. The value of the fishery does not go to the country. It goes to the fishing country. And I think if they had more resources, they'd have a better opportunity and better capacity to manage their resources, whether it's a distant water fleet or not. And Monica, I might ask actually Anita if you might want to talk a little, just for a minute, about the green reconstruction guidelines and what you're doing with those in Aceh and elsewhere, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Anita Van Breda with World Wildlife Fund. After the tsunami, WWF crafted green reconstruction policy guidelines that cover some 15 to 20 different topics that are involved with reconstruction after disaster. Livelihoods is one of those topics, and in this instance, it's primarily about fisheries and aquaculture. Those guidelines are pretty high level, policy level, so they're pretty broad and pretty generic, but they were received favorably by the government in Aceh, and different policies were put into place to try to build back Aceh in a better way, in a more green and sustainable way. The challenge has been working with the agencies that actually have the funds on the ground, the humanitarian aid agencies, and work with them to develop livelihood approaches and techniques that speak to those policy issues and help to operationalize them and make them real on the ground. So the example that Tom spoke about, a fisheries project that we're working on with American Red Cross and FAO, is to try to make those green policy guidelines real and meaningful on the ground for the long term, working with local communities. Some of that is about alternative livelihoods, but it's really focused on the livelihoods that were there before the tsunami and building them back in a way that's going to be more sustainable for the long term. And that's on the website, and I'm happy to provide any more or detailed information if that's of interest. Thank you.
Any other comments on the other questions?
Yes, on Dale's question, I think there are really three drivers of global demand on fish. First is tastes and changing tastes in countries, and clearly there's been a move towards eating more fish in developed countries. Population increase is a major factor, and also incomes. So that if you take a country like China, for example, the incomes have increased dramatically, and they're simply sucking in fish from not only the region, but from all over the world, in fact. The FAO has done a series of studies on the impact of globalization and fish trade, international fish trade, on food security. The results are a little bit mixed. I mean, there's certainly impacts on food security, and there's certainly impacts of globalization on stocks. I guess the problem is that with more and more liberal trade, you simply can't stop this process. So you have to try to tackle it at the country level and at the level of the fishery. One of the I guess the circuits within this is whether wealth and knowledge and so on can be generated within the communities targeting these particular fish stocks to enable them to manage these fisheries properly, in spite of the increased pressure of trade and so on the stocks, increased prices and so forth. And this again, it takes time. It's a long circuit. It takes time to build this awareness, to build the management, and I don't think it's been terribly successful up to now. So that, in my view, certainly the globalization process has contributed to depletion of fish stocks. I think that's fairly evident. How you deal with it is quite a different matter. On the small scale fisheries, I think the whole idea that I was presenting was simply that you need to create a surplus in terms of wealth, so that the fishery has to generate a surplus of wealth. It has to be better managed, and the examples, I think, are very few and far between. It involves convincing the communities that they must restrict fishing in some way, and generate this surplus in terms of rebuilding the stocks and making better use of whatever is fished. There are some examples, for example, from Tanzania, from parts of the Philippines, and so forth. Often these examples are transitory. They don't necessarily last. The institutions that are built up tend to founder under pressure. There was an interesting example just came across earlier this week, the Bali Straits sardine fishery, which I was a little bit familiar with in the past, where the two neighbouring provinces simply reduced capacity by stopping all the vessels from other provinces coming into the fishery. So it was a very politically acceptable solution, but many times the politics at the local level, at the district level, at the community level are such that you're facing very difficult political decisions to create this surplus, to create alternative livelihoods and stream people into these alternative livelihoods, use the wealth created to create these alternative livelihoods. It takes time, it takes patience, and I think the bank is trying to do some work on that. Perhaps in a couple of years' time I'll come back and tell you more about it. But right now we don't have much success. We do have success in other areas of agriculture, rural development, and so forth. And we'd like to try to build on some of those experiences to try to look at what we can do within the fishing communities. But it's clearly I think it's an order of magnitude more difficult and more complex. You're dealing with hidden resources, with lack of boundaries, lack of clarity in the management processes, so that the fish move, the fishers move, and so forth. So it's much more difficult than in agriculture and in many other natural resource management situations. Thank you.
Kara, I heard your question. I can answer more for you, but maybe I think you raised an important point. One of the things we have to do when we're working with communities or the private sector or whatever, whether we come from government or the NGO community, is to really step back from our perspective from which we come. So if I'm the biodiversity guy, I need to if I'm going to walk into a community and try and understand the community as a whole and understand what their needs are as well as their desires. And it may not be, at first blush, to save turtles as their sort of first order of business. And what we have to create is a process whereby the discussion allows everybody's needs and desires to be raised at an equal level, and not to go in and simply say, you have to do this because, and we're willing to pay you this much money, but to really try and understand what it is that will create a healthy community for them. And it's a challenge to do that, because we're used to just going in and telling people what we think, or it's a negotiation or whatever, you do this, we'll do that. But I think what we're trying to suggest here is to have a more generative discussion where we sit down together and we come up with the solutions as a collaborative effort, not one that's a negotiation. And I think there's an important distinction there.
Up here in the front, please.
Hi, thank you. Barbara Best from USAID. I want to thank all the speakers today. There was a very interesting article last week in the Washington Post about the wood and timber trade, the global trade. And reflecting on this, there's a lot of similarities about the issues that were discussed today, getting into not just the corruption but the organized crime aspect of it. Countries are losing their assets due to this unregulated trade and unenforced trade. People talk today about many of these same issues, that we really need to have a coordinated response. We have to address this whole gamut, the holistic approach, the systems approach that people have highlighted today. And I think it's going to take a lot of different organizations working together to address this, both helping to build the governance in the developing countries, but also addressing the role of the importing countries, clearly the timber trade and the fish trade. And so I appreciate all the different approaches people highlighted today, because I think it's a very complex issue, but I think it's time to also highlight how these are very similar to the tropical forests programs, both the biodiversity and the resources, and to try to raise the awareness of the complexity of the fisheries issues and the need to address this head on in many different ways. So thank you for your comments.
Anyone want to add anything on top of that?
Yeah, I just think I thought that Post article is a great example of what you're saying. A lot of people now are saying, what about China? What is China doing? It's the Chinese footprint, and it was pretty clear in that article that China was the place where the timber was being produced into furniture or whatever, but who was the consumer? The United States and Europe. So again, pointing the finger is obviously not going to be very useful, because we'll all be pointing our fingers at each other, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the other thing is we don't learn from cross-sectorally either. That we need to think more about what we can learn from our colleagues in the ag sector, the forestry sector, or what have you, and begin to share some of that kind of information as well. We tend to get stuck, the fish folk with the fish folk. Not that we're not good folk, but.
Yes, I think there's huge similarities between timber and fish. And in fact, if I wasn't here, I'd be at a think tank with the bank on natural resources governance to deal with a number of these issues across a whole range of issues, not just timber, but also minerals and oil and so forth, which have similar, but not quite as similar as with between fish and oil, or between fish and timber. But we do have a very close collaboration with our timber colleagues in the bank, and working closely with them. And I think we can learn a lot from them. Equally, they can learn a lot from us, particularly in terms of international instruments. There's a major lack of international instruments on the forest side. Fisheries and oceans do have I won't say a surplus of them, but we have major problems in implementing the instruments. We have a lot of instruments, have great difficulties in implementing them. The forests do have this. They have a forest legal. I think it's FLEG. It's called FLEG. Forest. I think it's legislation and governance program. They have also a global forest alliance that they're pushing, and a range of initiatives on governance of forests. And they're particularly concerned with some of these trade issues that you mentioned. I think I didn't see the article in the newspaper, but they're very concerned with these issues, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. Thanks again to all of our presenters. And again, be looking for an invitation in the next couple of days for our next event, which is on April 26th.